1 hour, and you could speak for maybe 20-25 minutes, and then we can take questions from the floor.
Okay.
President will conduct the question answer session.
Okay.
Is that fine with you, Mr. Smadja? Is that okay?
Sure. I will try to keep my remark as short as possible.
No, great. And if we have time, we can spill over another 5-7 minutes. That's not a problem. Okay.
Okay, very good.
Great. Well, a warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon, afternoon India time, and morning, Mr. Smadja's time from Switzerland.
Yes.
Very warm welcome to everybody on this special session with Mr. Claude Smadja, who has very kindly agreed to join us today for a session on how he sees the globe and how he sees India and the situation of the economy here. Well, he doesn't really need an introduction, but nonetheless, it is my duty to do this. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you. For those who do not know, Mr. Smadja played a key role in bringing global attention and investment to India in the 1990s, when he led the World Economic Forum as managing director. He advocated the cause of emerging markets in the early stages of globalization. And though since then he's moved on to set up his own global strategic consultancy, he has remained a friend of India. And he continues to advise governments and investors and business people on strategic affairs in this part of the world. Mr. Smadja has been an ardent supporter of globalization of business and people, even today when nationalism is now again raising his head and going down a narrow lane. His personal experience has been a big driver of his belief in the university of humans and importance to open borders. Mr. Smadja was born in Lebanon and his family relocated to Switzerland, where he made a life and career for himself. For him, an open, sensible world is not merely an ideal, but a necessary condition for the future of humanity. Over the past 5 decades, he spent a lot of time learning from and teaching to the most powerful people in the world. His deep knowledge and know-how of international economy and politics make him a valuable voice on platforms such as this and many others, and also an indispensable advisor to investors, professionals, policymakers, and so on. He's regarded as a specialist on China, India, Israel, the Gulf countries, Mexico, Singapore, Japan, and many, many others. But most importantly today, Mr. Smadja, we are delighted that in your role as a friend of AIMA, you are here with us today and have agreed to join us for the session. And it's my pleasure now to invite you for your remarks. And as we said that we will have a few questions and answers after this. Thank you very much, Mr. Smadja. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singhania. This is an extremely generous, I would say too generous introduction. In fact, it is not only a pleasure, but also a privilege to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with the members of AIMA's council, and in fact, with many friends. I have recognized so many names of friends among the people who are joining this virtual presentation. Let me share a few thoughts with you, and I will try to be as short as possible. Number one, I am really struck by the optimistic tone which has taken hold since the end of last year about the prospect of a global economy. Just last week, the OECD upgraded its forecast for 2021 for a 5.6% growth for the global economy, which is quite a significant increase from the 4.2% forecast that it had at the end of December last year. And this forecast of 5.6% is very close to the IMF forecast, which is 5.4 growth for the global economy. When you look at the United States, you have a situation where, depending on the organization, the growth forecast for this year is between 5.5% to 6.8%, which is quite remarkable, but at the same time, not so much surprising, given the fact that since the beginning of the pandemic, there have been $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus from the US government. When we speak about $6.6 trillion, we are talking about 27% of the US GDP in terms of fiscal stimulus, not counting, of course, the quantitative easing of the Federal Reserve. When you look at China, the picture is even more spectacular because, as you know, China was the only country registering a good growth of 2.3% in 2020. And also the official forecast announced at the National People's Congress last week of a growth of a little bit above 6% for 2021. In fact, all the forecasts are seeing a Chinese economic growth between 7 and 9% in 2021. So what you have is a kind of, if you want, rosy picture, which is sustained by the assumption that the vaccination process worldwide will continue increasing momentum, and that the pandemic will gradually be brought under control. And in this picture, of course, you have the two largest economies in the world playing the role of drivers for economic growth. Now, when you look a little bit closer to this picture, I would like to point out to some very important caveats. Number one, look at the Eurozone and more generally at Europe, at the European Union. Here, what we have seen since December of 2020 is a faltering pace of recovery. Obviously, Europe is not able so far to tame the spread of the pandemic. We have had prolonged lockdowns in all the major countries in Europe. We have a situation where the number of casualties keep increasing. And we have a situation where unemployment continues to rise. And so what you are talking about here is the second largest economic bloc in the world really having difficulties to shore up a recovery. And so this is something that will drag economic global prospects. Point number two, all the assessments that I have mentioned before, as I mentioned, are based on the assumption that vaccination continue to increase momentum, that the pandemic will in a way abate in many countries. But what we see is, first of all, that the risk of a third wave, even in the United States, cannot be excluded because you have a number of quote unquote rogue states which are already shedding all healthcare safety measures. We have spoken about Texas, which has eliminated all safety measures. Now the state of New York has eliminated quarantine for travelers from inside the United States, and you have other states doing that. So many medical experts are not excluding the risk of a third wave. The second point is that despite the pledge of President Biden at the beginning of the week, that by the end of May this year, all American adults in a way could be vaccinated, we know and we see that there are quite a number of logistical and distribution problems still in a way slowing down the vaccine distribution process. At this stage, as of the beginning of this week, there were close to 20 million vaccine doses which could not be inoculated so far. And so we see that the logistics are really creating a challenge, and we see that also in Europe, in addition to many people's reluctance to be vaccinated. So the assumption that everything will be good and well in a way handling the pandemic have to be really checked out by reality in the coming months. The third point that I would like to mention is that all these assumptions are based on the notion that what we will see is a kind of huge spending spree in rich countries in the coming months. The calculation is that in rich countries, household earnings have not been diminished by the pandemic because of financial support programs from government. In fact, a good quantity of households have seen their earnings increase in the pandemic. They could not spend the money because of a restriction. And now that as the conditions become normal or close to normal, they will be rushing to shopping malls, they will be rushing to travel, they will be rushing to spending the piles of cash on which they are sitting. I would submit to you that this view underestimate the very specific nature of the situation in which we are. We have not been in your classic run-of-the-mill recession, which would be followed by your classic run-of-the-mill recovery. The recession has been created by a huge, unprecedented magnitude shock, a trauma, which has affected in an unprecedented way not only the economies of countries, but has also created huge social dislocation, has created huge political pressures. And so, in my view, it would be maybe a little bit risky to consider that we will have this kind of recovery led by a huge spending spree. Of course, you will have many households spending more money, and especially because some programs are targeting low-income households, and so the money they receive will be spent immediately. But economies and consumption will have to go through a difficult process. It is not only a matter of considering the number of deaths, like 530,000 deaths in the US, 125,000 in the UK, 100,000 in Italy, 90,000 in France, and so on and so forth. What we need to consider is that the people who have survived the virus, many of them will have to live the rest of their life with damages, which will impact on their capabilities. We have to take into account the skills which have been lost because of the pandemic. We have to take into account the level of uncertainty and fear about the future that the pandemic and the exceptional situation it has created have generated in the mind and perception of the people. And so my opinion is that we should be a little bit careful about this assumption of a huge spending spree, which in the course of 2021 will in a way bring this spectacular recovery that markets are expecting. And in a way, you might think that this is in the back of the mind of central bankers, because when you see the position of central banker, when you look at the Fed, when you look at the European Central Bank, when you look at the Bank of Japan, when you look even at the RBI, what you see is that none of these central bank is ready to give up or to abandon or to reduce the quantitative easing program. None of these central banker is seeing a situation in the next 2 or 3 years where all of a sudden they will have to raise significantly short-term interest rates. And so they know that they have to do that because in a way the recovery will remain fragile. And it will remain fragile because of the conditions I have mentioned. But it means also something very important. It means that as quantitative easing continues in all these countries, equities and going toward emerging markets, because investor will continue to be searching for yield. Equities and some emerging markets, including India, will be in a way preferential destinations of investors. It means also something very important, that when you read in the newspaper or from commentators that all of a sudden we have again the big risk of a surge of inflation and that this will force central bankers to raise rates, don't believe this kind of commentators, this kind of analysis, because all central bankers have made it very clear that they don't see, you might have momentary short-term surge of inflations, especially in the US, and you might have some asset inflation. But there is a lot of slack in the economy. There is a lot of slack in the employment picture. And none of the central bankers is ready to take inflation as a kind of signal, as a kind of knee-jerk signal where you immediately raise interest rates. The ECB has made it very clear. Mr. Powell at the Federal Reserve has made it very clear. And when you speak about Japan, it has been already close to 10 years where they have been trying desperately without success to get inflation just closer to 1% per year. And the latest forecasts of the ECB look at inflation, which will be 1.2 this year, 1.4% next year, 1.3% in 2023, which is a far cry from the 2% target that is supposed to be a kind of trigger to consider touching interest rates. And so it means, in a way, that India should and could benefit for this situation of low interest rates that will continue for the next 2-3 years at least, and for a situation where no central banker will be looking at inflation target as a kind of necessary signal to change its position. I think this gives India a tremendous opportunity to accelerate not only its reform, but also to continue the cleaning up of its financial and banking sector. But when you look at the situation, I have spoken so far of economic and business factor, but you have a major geopolitical span in the work. And it is what is happening today between the US and China. We know now that the Biden administration will continue to have a very tough line against China, even a tougher line than the Trump administration, because it will be a less erratic and more systematic line against China. In addition to that, you have around Biden people like Antony Blinken, the State Department chief, Jack Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Virginia Nuland, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, who are ideologues in terms of human rights and making human rights the core of US foreign policy. This is a very risky position, because if it is to be pursued, then you are in a direct collision course with countries like China, but also like Russia and other countries in the world. If it is not fully pursued, as we have seen with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the publication of the CIA report on the murder of journalist Mr. Khashoggi, then you risk losing face and credibility, because you are not walking the talk in terms of human rights. In addition to that, the people around Biden seem to want to have, some of them seem to be itching for a fight with China. And they seem on some aspect to want to have an even harder stance than President Biden himself. And of course, they say that their policy toward China will be a mix of confrontation, cooperation, and competition. But it is not sure at all that the Chinese leadership will be ready to see that kind of mix in the same way. And already what we see and what has been confirmed by the National People's Congress discussion, which are ongoing at the moment, what we have seen is that China is very much preparing for a world where, technologically speaking, there will be a kind of division between two spheres, and where it will have to rely on its own capabilities. And it means something important. It means that they are accelerating the pace of catching up. They are sparing no resources, and they have resources in this catch-up process. In this kind of situation, the risk is that confrontation will lead to impact on economic activity around the world. we see that the Biden administration for the moment is not renouncing the use of sanctions and renouncing the weaponization of trade and economy against countries that it sees as adversaries. And when you have this proliferation of sanctions against countries like Iran, Russia, China, there is a lot of collateral damage because, of course, we know the tradition, the American tradition of extraterritoriality of American law. So this is something which, of course, is of crucial interest, in my view, for China, because China is in a situation where, of course, it wants to have a closer relationship with the United States, but it cannot afford a situation of outright hostility toward China, with which, as you know better than I do, it shares a border of almost 3,500 kilometers, and in which Chinese military strategic superiority will remain for the foreseeable future. And so the quandary for Indian diplomats is how to get closer to the United States, how, for instance, to benefit from the Quad framework, but not allowing, for instance, this Quad framework to become, as some people in Washington would wish it to be, a kind of NATO for the Indo-Pacific region. Because at the same time, it will be very difficult for India to become in a situation, to get into a situation where, because of its security risk and because of this situation, it will become even more dependent on US quote unquote protection. In addition to that, the situation with the Biden administration might become more complicated for two reasons. First of all, India has very good relationship with countries like Iran and Russia. Don't forget that the Americans don't see in a very benign way the fact that India has bought the S-400 Russian defense system. We know that the emphasis on human rights and civic liberty leads some people in Washington to want to criticize the Modi government. So the situation is not very simple and will be very difficult to handle. I think one very hopeful element in that is that with Mr. Jaishankar, India has certainly one of the best diplomats it could dream to have to handle a very delicate and complex situation. But it means also that while getting closer to the US, at some stage, accommodation with China, defining the terms of a modus vivendi, will have to be part of the immediate agenda for the country. I have been speaking for 25 minutes now. I will stop here so that we have time for discussion.
I think Mr. Singhania might have stepped out for a minute. So if I can step in and request perhaps Mr. Rajiv Kaul to ask the first question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rekha. And Claude, wonderful to have you again with us at AIMA. It's
delighted
a real...
to see you, delighted to see you, Rajiv.
And likewise, Claude, I'm looking for the opportunity to see you physically somewhere in the
Yes.
world. Hopefully after 6 months or 9 months, or maybe earlier, I don't know, but really looking forward to that. But in the meantime, it's lovely to see you virtually, and that too on a AIMA platform. Claude, as always, your sort of very nice economic, geopolitical analysis, which you did so succinctly in 25 minutes, was as always brilliant. And there are many questions, but I will restrict myself to one. You talked about the G20 growth rates now being projected at, I think, 5.6%, IMF at 5.4% for the globe as a whole, of rather for G20 countries. I think in India, that was going to be between 11 and 12%, China between 7 and 8% or something like that. But my question is, going forward, how do you see the growth rates of China progressing and the growth rates of India progressing, particularly keeping in mind that both the economies, the growth rates were coming down prior to the COVID situation, particularly the Indian economy, which had come down from 8.5% to a low of 4.5%. So that's my question. So beyond the next year, which is everybody's got a lot of hope and confidence in the growth rates, but how do you see the year thereafter for our two economies, particularly India and China?
So Claude, would you like to take two or three together, or would you want to go one by one?
Let us try to take one by one, and I will try to keep my answers short.
Okay.
Even if it is at the cost of not being very detailed. But regarding Rajiv's question, I think, of course, China growing at 7 to 9% in 2021, this kind of performance cannot be repeated after maybe 2022 or something like that. And I think China will get back to a growth rate of between 5 to 6% in the years after, say, after 2022. I think China will be able to sustain this growth rate for 2 or 3 reasons. Reason number one, they have made a tremendous effort to continue their fight against the latest fringes of extreme poverty in the country. And they seem to have made some good achievement in that domain. And so what you will have is domestic consumption in the coming years continuing to play a very, very significant role in boosting economic growth and gradually replacing exports as a driver for economic growth. The second factor in mind is the fact that China is now putting tremendous effort, and this will bring tremendous benefits for the economy in what they call new infrastructure, meaning by that artificial intelligence, mega data center, 5G, telecommunications, new materials, and accelerated process of digitalization of the economy. And they have started this effort already 2 years ago. And last year, in fact, in March 2020, they made the decision to accelerate this drive toward the building and development of new infrastructure in addition to traditional classic infrastructure. So this is the second reason. The third reason is that gradually the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was signed last October with 15 Asian countries, including India, not including India, this RCEP, in fact, will drive benefits for the Chinese economy, because at the end of the day, for many of the countries members of the RCEP, it will mean the creation of a zone of, I would say, economic prosperity centered around China, and the increasing symbiosis, economic symbiosis and business symbiosis between ASEAN countries and China. So this is for China. Now for India, I do believe that past this year of 11% growth, I think the key for China to achieve what is possible, which is a 9% a sustainable growth rate, requires two things. Number one, it requires accelerated effort in terms of infrastructure development. And it requires also, and this infrastructure development implies the broadening and expansion of the country's industrial base. The country's industrial base remains still too narrow for a country the size and potential of India. The second factor is that at the moment, India has taken some steps to try to benefit from the reshaping of some global supply chains. I think this effort needs to be much more accelerated because India, in some domains, let us be realistic, in some domains, can really play a much bigger role in this reshaping, redistribution of global supply chains. And if over the next 2-3 years, it can really put itself on the map for some sector as a good alternative, then the boost to the economy and to investment will be quite significant. And I think a kind of 8-9% growth becomes feasible. But of course, it means that the impact of the pandemic, which has been quite significant, be dealt with over the next 2 years in a more decisive way than has been the case so far.
Thank you very much, Claude. It was very, very comprehensive indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, there are several questions, Mr. Smadja. So if you agree, can I get 2 or 3 people to ask the questions? And if there are any commonality, you may want to answer comprehensively in the interest of time. Okay. So can I ask Mr. Sunit Khan Munjal to come in, and then Mr. Jalan, Mr. Sudhir Jalan, please.
Sure. Thank you, Claude. As always, absolutely brilliant, outstanding analysis.
You are very kind.
So my question is around India's new mission of creating self-sufficiency, what you call the Atmanirbhar Bharat. From the outside, what does it look like? We want to be careful that it does not turn India into an isolationist, closed country like the old days. Second part of the same question is a segue to what you just said. Which are the areas, when you look at it, India from the outside, which are the areas you think India can and needs to excel to become a global player?
Mr. Jalan?
Claude, I think you made me very happy by projecting that we will next year also grow at 9%. That would be phenomenal. That looks a bit optimistic to me. But the government of India and Prime Minister himself has taken some very bold measures. On the other hand, we have the very rising prices of crude, which affects India very badly. And God forbid, if the interest rates rise and the capital withdraws, that can be a bit of setback. So what would be your surmise on this? And another question, do you feel India's growth should be led by service industries as it has been, or more by manufacturing?
Thank you.
Yeah, you could take these two, please, and then we can come to the next round.
Okay. First, the first question about India, I would say self-sufficiency. Quite frankly, I think it is not a goal that should be pursued because at the moment and for the foreseeable future, we have to be realistic. And India doesn't have at this moment the resources to achieve self-sufficiency. Even China, which has today a GDP which is about close to 5 times India's GDP, is not able to achieve self-sufficiency. They are striving to get into that situation, but they know, and this is a major concern for them, that in some areas they cannot achieve that. And this is why they are desperately looking for alternative courses as the US closes its doors more and more. And so I believe that it is not the proper course for India to do that. On the contrary, I think the proper course for India is to try to achieve greater integration into the global economy. And this is also the only way in which India can defend its interest in international organizations like, for instance, rejuvenated, if you want, WTO with the new head that the organization has. And so I think there should be no mistake about the strategy to follow. With respect to sectors, let me mention quite a few. First of all, automotive. It is an obvious one. Artificial intelligence. India is the third largest power, if you want, with respect to artificial intelligence potential. Pharma, when you know that the biggest producer of vaccine in the world is an Indian company, it shows you, for instance, the kind of capabilities. Pharma is really a sector where India has made tremendous development and can continue to do that. Biotech is also another very promising sector. To some extent, aerospace is also a promising sector. India's performance in terms of aerospace has been quite remarkable and significant. So these are some, of course, software. When we speak about areas, software remains a big driver and has continued to have the kind of potential we have seen. So these are, as example, some of the sectors where really the future might be very promising. So I will stop there with this first question. The second question, first of all, with respect to the question about services versus, quote unquote, versus industry, I do believe that as much as services are and will remain a very important driver for growth in India. And I am talking not only of services as we have known, but for instance, the services that so many very talented startups are now creating in the domains of fintech, as an example, in the domain of digital healthcare, in the domain of deep tech. All these services of software as a services are, of course, very good sources for growth, but it is not a substitute for expanding the industrial base of the country. Again, the size of this industrial base remains an anomaly. And quite frankly, the Make in India motto, which was initiated by this government, has a long way to go before becoming a full reality. And I think there are domains also, back to the question, where industry in the high-tech and the electronic sector have not really been seriously leveraged so far. With respect to the question about crude price increase, yes, oil is now at $70 a barrel, which is a significant increase from the very low it was in 2020. But I don't believe that it will go. Some people have been talking about a $100 a barrel prospect by the end of this year. I don't believe in that. I think the situation at the moment is in a way artificially maintained because of the agreement between Russia and the OPEC countries, namely Saudi Arabia, who need to have a price level able to sustain their own budget requirements. But I do believe that at $70, $75 a barrel, we will have a kind of situation where in a way countries can still manage. But it means something very important. It means that India has a role to play in accelerating the development of alternative energies. And already India has made significant progress in that. But the potential in terms of these alternative energies, the potential, for instance, that can be exploited from India being a sea country, a coastal country, in terms of wind energy, wave energy, all these alternative energies. This is the time now to launch into exploring and developing their potential, because dependence on fossil fuels and dependence on oil over the next, say, 5 to 10 years will become more and more an anomaly. And so I think this is the time for India to develop the new areas of alternative energy, and especially when we see now how China is developing marine-based energy, alternative energy. I think this is something that India should consider very seriously. Last but not least, capital flows. I think you're right. Capital flows come and go. They are coming to India now. They might go back tomorrow. This is why I always have been an advocate that FDI is much better that institutional investment. It is more stable. I think it brings much more economic long-term benefits to the country. This is the contribution that it can make, and this is where the point about inserting India in the reshaped global supply chain, for me, is a key priority for the country over the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smadja. The next two questions, Mr. Srinivas Tempo and Mr. Ganesh Natarajan. Srini, would you please go ahead? Thanks.
Thanks, Claude, for that amazing presentation. My question to you is basically whatever data that is coming in India, although we are seeing green shoots in the economy and we are looking at a very aggressive growth rate, the employment rate is not very encouraging. We are not seeing positive employment data as yet. Your take on this, please, whether the situation, I think companies have become more efficient. They're not increasing the employment. I mean, I have heard figures from even banks, those were used to employ about 10,000 are not going to employ more than 2,000 people. So is this a state, because India has a unique problem, of unequal distribution of wealth. So do we have to live with this situation, or you are hopeful that this will change? Thank you.
Let me just add to that question, Mr. Smadja. I have actually two questions. One is a corollary to what Srinivas said, because clearly, thanks to this Atmanirbhar initiative that Sunil alluded to, we are creating clusters and opportunities for productivity-linked incentives for master or champion companies to come in. So hopefully that will generate a level of employment which we have not seen in the last 10 years. So I think that's one economic response to what you rightly said. We need to grow 2% faster than China for the next 20 years. That's important. The other question I want to ask you was back to your geopolitical argument, because you mentioned RCEP, and as you know, for various reasons, we have stayed out of RCEP. But we do have Quad. In fact, the Quad leaders are meeting today as we speak. And there is an opportunity to maybe take another axis of geopolitical opinion. Of course, the President Trump was
Sorry, I cannot hear you there.
Request everybody to mute their mics, please, except those who are speaking. Thank you. Sorry, Ganesh.
No problem. Thanks, Harsh. Sorry, Ms. Smadja. No, I was just asking you that, now that India is looking at Quad as an alternative axis, because we are not participating in RCEP, and we can't really predict which way the Americans will go, because while President Trump was very vocally anti-China, President Biden will probably hedge his bets a little bit because he has other battles to fight. So do you think India should primarily take the economic revival strategy, or should we also be fighting it on a geopolitical sense?
Okay, let me first turn to the issue of unemployment rate. I think the surge of unemployment rate that you have mentioned, Mr. Dempo, is of course something that we have seen in Europe, some things that we have seen in the US, where it is estimated that because of the pandemic, 10 million jobs were lost in 2020. Now they have recuperated some of these jobs, but the problem in the US is that the labor participation rate in the economy has declined, which means that the decline in the unemployment rate is hiding also a problem of structural unemployment, people coming out of the economic circuit. But also in the case of China, as you rightly mentioned, it is a result of the digitalization process in which a number of companies are going at the moment. And they have to do that because if they want to remain competitive, they have to go into this digitalization process to increase productivity and remain competitive. But as you said, or you implied, a country like India cannot live with that, cannot live with a widening wealth distribution gap, because the political and social consequences at some stage will be too high a price. And this is where, in fact, I do believe, and I have been advocating that for some time, that in the era of globalization, countries need a genuine, effective industrial policy. What does that mean, industrial policy in the 21st century? It means that you have to synchronize and to coordinate and to synergize between education policy, tax policy, trade policy, research and development policy. To some extent, China, despite all the structural problems that they have and that they continue to have, China has been very successful at industrial policy. Until recently, Japan has been very successful. Singapore has been very successful. Korea has been very successful. Israel has been very successful. And what we see today is that France was not so successful, but so and so in terms of industrial policy. But now this notion that effective industrial policy is a prerequisite in the present economic global situation. This notion is gaining ground. In fact, we see some people in the Biden administration starting to advocate that, although this notion was anathema for so many years in the United States. But they see that today, and for instance, the success of the US in some key high-tech area has been the result of industrial policy, in fact. And so this is why, for instance, today, this is one of the reasons why today, for instance, the government wants to achieve some control on the big high-tech companies and not let them go their own way without any control. And so I think your only way to do that is to create this kind of holistic approach to development through industrial policy. At the moment, I don't see any other way. Now, with respect to the other question, I don't think that the Quad, as it exists, is an alternative to RCEP. I think India at the moment has really no other choice than to try to increase its economic and business linkages with some ASEAN countries. And in that respect, the relationship with Singapore can be a channel for that. I think the relationship with Europe should be increased to find ways to expand the economic and business interaction with India. The problem of India is that at the moment, contrary to China, it doesn't have it has not created really a kind of network of economic and business alliances. The relationship that India has with its closest neighbors is, of course, useful and beneficial, but these closest neighbors, contrary to what is the case in the relationship between China and ASEAN, is not synergetical or is not providing enough synergies. I think I would not count too much on a greater access to the US market. We have seen that, for instance, when it comes to public projects, the Biden administration is taking a very protectionist approach. And so this might restrict the potential for Indian companies to tap this infrastructure potential if the Biden administration develop its plan for an infrastructure revival in the United States. But I do believe that with respect to the new technologies, with respect to the development of India's startup ecosystem, which is remarkable, I think this is where the interaction between India and the US can be tremendously developed, because I think there could be very good complementarities between the India startup ecosystem, including the VCs and private equity companies, and the US ecosystem, startup ecosystem, looking for alternative now that in a way the route to the Chinese ecosystem is becoming much more limited.
Mr. Smadja, thank you very much. There are many more questions from the participants, but I'm afraid we have completely run out. And thank you very much once again. I mean, in your inimitable style, you have very directly touched on all the points in your presentation and in your remarks about some of the major things, and in a very precise manner, and also given your views on to the questions asked on a whole range of subjects. And I'm always amazed every time I hear you, and I'm sure all my colleagues who are on the call, as to your breadth and also depth of understanding of global affairs, whether they are economics or geopolitical. And I think many of the points that you made make a lot of sense from the way we look at it. So thank you very much for this extraordinary suggestion for our session. If you look at the chat and a whole lot of things, it has been very well received. I'm happy. And we have had hundreds of people viewing this session directly or through the social media. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, as I said, since we're out of time, we can't take some of the questions that other members had, and I apologize for that. But thank you very much for participating in this session and for supporting AIMA in the initiative. Thank you indeed. Rekha, any last words?
Thank you so much, Claude. They were, I think we got some wonderful comments on the chat, if you take a look at it. Always a pleasure to have you with us. You have been a friend of AIMA's and very supportive towards us. And you didn't hesitate at all in accepting our invitation. I think we need to do another session with you to take all the other questions which have come in. I don't think 1 hour is enough. And my apologies to Mr. Jairaj. I know you had a question, but I'll connect you to Claude separately and perhaps
with pleasure. Yes.
Claude, we're also going to make you an honorary member of AIMA.
Yeah,
It will
That's
be
a
a
good
great
idea.
it will be a great honor. But Mr. Singhania and Rekha, if I may, first of all, thank you for having me. As I said, it has been and it is always a pleasure and an honor to interact with AIMA and its member. I am always delighted to share views and to discuss, because there could be different views and I think we can learn from each other. And so my only hope is that next time we can do that, not virtually, but physically among a good group of friends. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Pleasure, pleasure. We've
Thank
had
you.
presidents here on this call and a lot of members. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Big hand to Claude. Big hand. Thank you,
Thank
Claude.
you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Claude.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.